Hello and welcome to Bedtime Cozy Tales, where we listen, we relax, and we get sleepy. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge something. You made it. Whatever today asked of you, whatever it demanded, whatever it took, you carried it all the way to this moment. And now at last, you can set it down, all of it, right here. Tonight I'm going to take you somewhere very far away, to a small, quiet street in a city that never fully sleeps, and yet, somehow, always knows how to be still. We're going to Japan, to a tiny cafe tucked between two old buildings on a narrow lane in Kyoto, a place where the rain falls soft and steady on a paper lantern outside the door, where the smell of roasted barley tea drifts through the warm air, where time moves slowly and no one is in any hurry at all. You don't need to do anything tonight. You don't need to follow along carefully. You don't need to remember a single word. All you need to do is breathe and listen, and let the story carry you gently all the way down into sleep. So let's take just a moment before we begin to settle in. Feel the weight of your body against the bed. Notice the places where you are supported. Your head resting into the pillow, your shoulders releasing into the mattress, your legs growing heavy and still. Take a slow breath in through the nose. Hold it just for a moment and breathe out. Long and slow, let your jaw soften, let your hands uncurl, let the space between your eyebrows smooth out. There's nowhere to be tonight, nothing to solve, nothing to plan. Only this, only now, only the soft sound of rain beginning to fall on a quiet street in Kyoto. Music softens further. Rain deepens slightly. The rain began sometime in the night. No one heard it start. It simply arrived, the way rain does in Kyoto, quietly, without announcement, as though it had always been there and the dry days before it were the unusual ones. By the time the first pale light began to gather at the edges of the sky, the narrow lane called Nishikidori was already dark and gleaming. The old stone pavement reflected the amber glow of the paper lanterns strung between the buildings above. Each lantern wore a small cap of water now, trembling slightly in the gentle current of air that moved through the lane. Droplets gathered at the lantern's lower edge and fell one by one into the puddles below. Plip, plip, plip. The sound was the only sound for a long moment. Then, far away, a temple bell rang once. Its note was low and round, like something dropped into still water. It spread outward through the grey morning air and slowly dissolved into the sound of the rain. The lane was lined on both sides with old wooden buildings, their dark timber facades weathered to a deep charcoal brown by decades of Kyoto winters and Kyoto summers. Their roof lines curved upward at the edges in the old style. Beneath each eave, the rain dripped in a steady curtain, pooling in the shallow gutters that ran along each side of the lane. Most of the buildings were still dark. Their paper screens were closed, their wooden shutters pulled to. The whole street had the feeling of something deeply, peacefully asleep, but not everything was still. At the far end of the lane, in a building barely wider than a doorway, a light was on. It was not a bright light. It was the colour of warm amber, and it glowed through a small square window hung with a curtain of dark indigo fabric. Above the door, a single lantern burned, round and white, with 3 characters painted on it in black ink. And from beneath the door, curling out into the cool morning air, came something extraordinary. The smell of roasting grain, warm and nutty and faintly sweet. The smell of mugicha, barley tea, being prepared for the first time that morning. This was the cafe. It had no grand name above the door, no sign on the street announcing its presence. Just the lantern, just the light, just the smell that drifted through the rain like a quiet invitation. Inside, the cafe was very small. If you had walked in from the rain and stood just inside the door, you could have seen the entire room in a single glance. There were 5 low tables, each made from a thick slice of wood, pale cedar, sanded smooth but not lacquered, so that the grain still showed beneath your fingertips, like the lines on a map of somewhere beautiful. Each table sat close to the floor, Around each one, there were 2 or 3 cushions, flat and square, covered in fabric the color of moss or charcoal or deep indigo. The walls were the color of old cream. Along one wall, a narrow shelf held a row of small ceramic cups, each one different, each one the work of a different potter's hands. Some were rough textured and brown, like river stones. Some were glazed in deep ocean blue with a crackle pattern that caught the light. Some were pale celadon green, so thin you could almost see through them when you held them to the lantern. At the far end of the room, behind a low wooden counter, was the kitchen area. It was not much more than a small gas burner, a worn wooden cutting board, a row of clay pots in graduated sizes, and a shelf of glass jars filled with dried things, loose-leaf teas in shades of green and gold and brown, dried flowers, whole spices. The wooden floor was very old and very dark. It creaked in certain places in a way that the owner knew by heart. 3 steps in from the door, a soft groan. Near the window, a higher note, like a question. Behind the counter, a steady, familiar rhythm, like a very slow drum. The ceiling was low, crossed with dark timber beams from which hung a few simple things. A dried bundle of cedar, a small paper lantern, dark now, saving itself for evening. A string of wooden beads that stirred occasionally in some imperceptible movement of air, and in one corner, near the window, a small ceramic dish held a single stick of incense. It had been lit some time ago. Its thread of smoke rose in a perfectly straight line toward the ceiling, then bent and curled, as incense smoke always does, into patterns no one can predict and no one needs to understand. The smell of it was very faint. Hinoki wood and something green, perhaps pine, perhaps moss. It mixed with the barley tea and the old timber and the rain smell drifting in beneath the door, and the result was something that had no name in any language, but your body would have recognized it immediately. It was the smell of deep rest. It was the smell of arriving somewhere you didn't know you were looking for. The owner of the cafe was a woman named Hannah. She was not young and she was not old. She moved through the small kitchen with the ease of someone who has done the same things, in the same order, in the same small space, for many years, and found that repetition, rather than dulling the pleasure, had made it deeper. Every morning she arrived before the light. She walked the same route from her apartment, 7 minutes through lanes, so familiar she could have walked them with her eyes closed. She wore the same dark indigo apron over her quiet clothes. She lit the same gas burner with the same click-click-click of the ignition. She filled the same clay pot with water drawn from the same tap, and she began. This morning she was preparing the barley tea first, as always. She spooned the roasted barley grains into the largest of the clay pots, dark brown, perfectly round, smooth with years of use, and set it on the burner. As the water heated, she stood with her hands resting lightly on the counter and listened to the rain. It was falling steadily now, not hard, not in the dramatic way that summer rains sometimes fell in Kyoto, but with a kind of quiet persistence, as though it had no intention of stopping and no particular hurry either. Hana found this kind of rain deeply satisfying. It was honest rain, rain that was simply itself without performance. She watched the water in the pot begin to tremble at the bottom. Small bubbles formed on the clay, then rose and released. The barley grains shifted slightly in the current. Their colour was beginning to bloom into the water now, pale gold at first, then deepening to amber, then to something richer and warmer that had no precise colour name but that Hannah thought of, privately, as the colour of late afternoon in autumn. She lowered the flame. She did not use a timer. She never had. She knew by the smell, by the exact moment when the roasted warmth of the grain deepened into something nutty and full, when the tea was ready. While the barley steeped, she turned to the preparation of the morning's food. Today she would make onigiri, rice balls, and a small pot of miso soup with tofu and wakame seaweed, and perhaps, if she had time before the first customer arrived, a small plate of pickled daikon, pale yellow and faintly translucent, sliced into careful rounds. She had made all of these things so many times that her hands knew what to do before her mind gave any instructions. She moved without rushing. She moved without wasted motion. She was not thinking about the rain or the day ahead or anything that required solving. She was simply here in this small kitchen doing these small things. And the rain continued, and the barley tea deepened, and the cafe waited, warm and amberlit and full of its own quiet contentment for the morning to begin. The first customer arrived at 10 minutes past 6. Hannah heard him before she saw him. The particular sound of his umbrella being shaken outside the door. 3 brisk but gentle shakes, the same every morning, and then the soft scrape of his shoes on the small stone step. The door slid open on its wooden track with a sound like a low, soft exhale. He stepped inside and bowed his head slightly. Hannah returned the bow from behind the counter. His name was Tanaka-san. He was a retired school teacher, though Hannah had only learnt this by slow accumulation over many years. A word here, a small detail there. He was a man of few words and great consistency. He came every morning except Sunday. He always sat at the same table, the one nearest the window, in the corner where the draft from the door could not reach him. He always ordered the same thing, barley tea, served hot in the rough brown ceramic cup he had long ago claimed as his own, and onigiri with pickled plum. He always brought a book, though he did not always read it. Sometimes he simply held it in his lap and looked at the rain. This morning, he settled himself onto his cushion with the careful deliberateness of someone whose knees require a moment of negotiation. He set his book on the table, something old, its spine worn smooth. He folded his hands. He looked at the rain falling on the lane outside the window, and then, with the particular sigh of a man who has been awake since before dawn and has been waiting, not impatiently, but with great readiness, for exactly this, he relaxed. Hannah brought his tea without being asked. She set it on the table with both hands, as was her custom. The cup was warm. The steam rose from its surface in a single wavering column. The smell reached him a moment before the warmth did. He wrapped both hands around the cup. The ceramic was rough under his palms, slightly uneven, textured from the potter's fingers, still carrying some memory of the hands that had shaped it. He lifted it to his lips. The first sip of barley tea on a cold, rainy morning. There are small pleasures in this world that cannot be improved upon. This was one of them. By 7 o'clock, the rain had settled into its rhythm. It was not going anywhere. This was clear now, not from any darkening of the sky, for the sky in Kyoto on a rainy autumn morning simply becomes one pale, seamless grey, without drama, but from the way it fell, evenly, without variation, like breathing. 2 more customers had arrived. A young woman who worked at the ceramics gallery 3 lanes over and who came to the cafe before her shift because she had once told Hannah it was the only place in the city where she felt fully awake and fully rested at the same time. She sat cross-legged on her cushion with a small notebook open on the table before her, a pen in her hand, though she was not writing at the moment. She was looking at the rain. The other new arrival was a man Hannah did not know well. He had started coming about a month ago. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a little older, one of those faces that is difficult to place in time. He came in the rain, always. On dry mornings he did not appear. He ordered green tea, a light gyokuro, pale and slightly sweet, and a small piece of the sesame cake that Hannah kept under a glass dome on the counter. He had a quality of stillness about him that Hannah appreciated. He did not look at his telephone. He did not bring a laptop or books or papers. He simply sat and drank his tea and looked at the rain from beneath slightly lowered eyelids, as though the act of watching the rain required a particular kind of interior focus that nothing else could provide. Hannah thought of him, privately, as the rain customer. This seemed accurate. The cafe had filled to its comfortable capacity, 5 people including Hannah herself. and the sound of the rain outside had become the room's primary music. It fell on the stone lane. It fell on the curved roof tiles. It collected in the iron water barrel at the corner of the building and dripped from its rim with a hollow, bell-like sound. Tock, 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 in a slightly different rhythm from the rain itself. It ran down the window in thin, branching rivers. Inside, the barley tea was warm in its pot on the burner. The miso soup had been made and served and appreciated. The onigiri sat on their small plates, each one a neat triangle wrapped in a square of dark nori, gleaming with the particular sheen of freshly made rice. The incense had burned down to a small pale curl of ash in its ceramic dish, and the room held everyone gently, as this room always did, as though it had been designed not merely for sitting and drinking and eating, but for the particular human need to feel, just for a little while, that the world is small and warm and entirely manageable. In the quiet between customers, Hannah made herself a cup of tea. This was her private ritual. She did not do it in a hurry, and she did not do it for any practical purpose. She was not particularly thirsty. She was not tired. She made the tea because the making of it was, in itself, the thing. She chose a tea from the small glass jar on the highest shelf, a gyokuro from Uji, the region just south of Kyoto, where the tea gardens were shaded with black cloth for several weeks before the harvest to deepen the leaves' sweetness. She measured the leaves carefully into a small clay teapot. The pot was very old, older than the café, older than Hana's memory of the café, which stretched back to childhood when her grandmother had operated this same small room. It was the colour of aged iron, rough textured, with a short curved spout and a lid that fit so perfectly it made a faint whisper of suction when you lifted it. She brought the water to the temperature she wanted, not boiling, never boiling for gyokuro, hovering at around 60 degrees, which she gauged by feeling the steam above the pot against the back of her wrist. She poured the water slowly, letting it fill the teapot in a thin, unhurried stream. She covered the pot. She waited. The waiting was not an inconvenience. The waiting was the point. There is a concept in Japanese culture, ma, which translates roughly as pause, or interval, or negative space. It is the silence between notes, the breath between words, the emptiness inside a clay bowl that allows the bowl to hold something. Without ma, there is no music. There is only noise. Without ma, there is no rest. There is only the exhausting accumulation of activity without pause. Hana understood ma not as a concept, but as a physical sensation. She felt it now, standing at her counter, hands still, the teapot warming in the curve of her palm, the rain falling outside, the small sounds of the café drifting around her like water around a stone. This pause, this interval, this moment that was not empty at all, but full of something that did not need a name. She poured the tea. It came out the colour of pale jade. She lifted the cup, thin celadon, cool and smooth, to her lips. The taste was gentle and deeply complex, vegetal and sweet simultaneously, like the smell of a forest after rain, translated into flavour. She drank it slowly. She looked at the rain. She thought of nothing that required solving. The young woman with the notebook had begun to write. Not quickly, and not with any appearance of urgency, but steadily, in small, careful strokes, the kind of writing that is not trying to capture something before it escapes, but that is simply recording what is already there, already still, already waiting patiently to be noticed. Tanaka-san had finished his second cup of barley tea and had opened his book. He held it at the angle of a man who has been reading for many decades, close to his face, slightly tilted, the spine loose in his hand. His face, when he reread, was entirely peaceful. Whatever world existed inside those pages received his full, unhurried attention. The rain customer had ordered a second cup of gyokuro and showed no signs of leaving. Hannah found this pleasing. She liked it when people settled in. She had not opened this cafe for the sake of rapid turnover. She had opened it because she believed, as her grandmother before her had believed, that people needed, more than almost anything else, a place to slow down, not to stop, not to escape, but simply to slow down enough that they could feel themselves again. To hear their own thoughts at a pace at which thoughts could actually be heard. She began preparing the second portion of the morning's baking. Today she was making dorayaki, small round pancakes sandwiched with sweet red bean paste. She made them in small batches, no more than 6 at a time, because they were best eaten fresh, slightly warm, the edges of the pancakes still just barely soft. She mixed the batter in a small ceramic bowl, eggs, honey, flour, baking powder, a small spoonful of mirin. She stirred it with a wooden spoon in slow, wide circles. The batter fell from the spoon in a thick, even ribbon. She heated the pan, a flat iron pan, perfectly seasoned, completely black, over the low flame, and waited until the surface was just the right temperature. She knew this not by looking but by feeling. She held her palm above the pan at a particular height. When the warmth reached her hand in a specific way, steady even, not aggressive, the pan was ready. She ladled small circles of batter onto the surface. They spread slowly, perfectly round. After a moment, tiny bubbles appeared across the surface, first at the edges, then moving inward, and she watched them without urgency. When the bubbles had almost entirely covered the surface of each pancake, and the edges had set to a pale gold, she flipped each one with a practiced turn of the spatula. One smooth motion, no hesitation. The underside was golden brown, a perfect, even colour, like the surface of something that has been given exactly the right amount of warmth for exactly the right amount of time. She lifted them from the pan. She spread the sweet red bean paste, dark and earthy and subtly sweet, across the flat side of one pancake. She pressed the second gently on top. A small amount of paste squeezed to the edges, just a little, just enough to tell you it was generously filled. She set each dorayaki on a small square of white paper and placed them on the counter. The smell was extraordinary, warm and eggy and faintly sweet, with the deep, quiet richness of the bean paste underneath. Even Tanaka-san looked up from his book. At some point in the late morning, the rain changed. It did not stop, but it became something slightly different. Lighter, finer, more like mist than rainfall. The individual drops were no longer visible on the window. Instead, the glass simply gathered moisture, the whole surface becoming slightly blurred so that the lane outside appeared as a soft watercolor impression of itself. The stone pavement, the dark buildings, the paper lanterns still glowing amber in the grey morning air, all of it rendered in soft edges, all of it made beautiful and a little dreamlike by the fine curtain of rain between the window and the world. The young woman with the notebook had closed it and was now simply sitting. She had her hands wrapped around a second cup of barley tea. She had switched from green tea at some point, following some internal preference that required no explanation. Her face was turned toward the window. She was not thinking about the ceramics gallery she would soon need to open. She was not thinking about the things she had written in her notebook. She was simply watching the way the mist gathered on the glass and the lantern light moved through it. There is a Japanese phrase for this kind of beauty, mono no aware. It means, roughly, the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, the poignant recognition that beautiful things are beautiful, partly because they will not last. The cherry blossoms are beautiful because they fall. The autumn leaves are beautiful because they are turning. The rain on the window is beautiful because it will stop, and the morning in this small cafe, warm and amber and full of the smell of barley tea and fresh dorayaki, is beautiful because it too is passing, and the people in it will one day rise from their cushions and step back out into the lane and go on with the rest of their lives. But right now, they are here, and the rain is here, and the warmth is here, and none of them are in any hurry at all. A new customer arrived just after 11. She was elderly, very elderly, and she moved with the careful, considered grace of someone who has learned through long experience that each movement deserves full attention. She shook her small umbrella at the door. She removed her shoes on the stone step. She placed her feet into the small indoor slippers that Hannah kept on the shelf beside the entrance. She bowed to Hannah. She bowed to Tanaka-san, who returned the bow from his cushion. She settled herself at the table in the center of the room, the lowest table with the softest cushion. She folded her hands on her knees. She looked around the room with the quiet satisfaction of someone returning to a place that has been, for a very long time, a source of reliable comfort. Her name was Yoshida-san. She was 81 years old. She had been coming to this cafe since it was run by Hana's grandmother. She had been coming to this cafe for longer than most of the buildings in the lane had been standing in their current form. She ordered nothing specific. She never did. She simply looked at Hana with a particular expression, patient, expectant, trusting, and Hana would bring her whatever seemed right that morning. Today she brought her a cup of the hojicha, roasted green tea, amber brown and gentle on the stomach, and 2 of the freshly made dorayaki on their square of white paper. Yoshida-san looked at them for a moment. She lifted one and held it in both hands. She bit into it carefully. The pancake was still slightly warm. The bean paste was sweet and deep. She chewed slowly. Her expression did not change dramatically, but something in it settled further, as though the final, small piece of something had been found and put into place. She looked at the rain through the misty window. She held her cup. She was in no hurry. She had arrived at an age where there was very little left that needed hurrying. The morning was here. The tea was warm. The rain was falling outside. And she was in the only cafe in Kyoto that smelled exactly like her memory of being 7 years old on a rainy morning in autumn, eating something sweet at a low wooden table, while the world moved gently outside. The hours passed in the way that hours pass when no one is counting them. Not quickly, not slowly, simply, fully, each one complete. Hana refilled cups. She made fresh pots of tea. She added more dorayaki to the plate and replenished the small dish of pickled radish. She swept the floor near the entrance where wet footprints had gathered, using a short broom with soft bristles. She replaced the incense, choosing a different stick this time, one with a sandalwood base, warmer and more resinous than the hinoki of the morning. She wiped down the counter with a cloth that she wrung out precisely and folded into thirds before using, because her grandmother had always done it that way, and because some habits deserve to be preserved. The customers came and went. Tanaka-san left around 10, with his book under his arm and a small bow from the doorway. The young woman with the notebook left at 11, tucking her pen carefully into the spiral of the book's cover. The rain customer stayed through to almost noon, finishing 3 cups of gyokuro with perfect, unhurried patience. When he finally rose from his cushion, he bowed to Hana with an exactness that felt like something meant. She returned it, and he stepped out into the mist and disappeared into the lane without looking back. New people arrived, a couple in matching rain jackets who were visiting Kyoto for the first time, and who had discovered the cafe by following the smell down the lane. They looked at everything with the wide-eyed attention of people newly arrived in a beautiful place, and Hana let them look, answering their questions gently and briefly, pointing out the shelf of handmade cups, explaining the difference between the teas. A man with a large camera bag who ordered 1 coffee, the only coffee Hana made, a simple hand-drip method that took 4 quiet minutes, and sat by the window shooting 100 photographs of the rain on the glass. A student who fell asleep over her textbook within 15 minutes of sitting down, and whom Hana let sleep for nearly an hour, because she had always believed that sleeping students were a sign of a good cafe. In the middle of the afternoon, when the cafe was quieter and only Yoshida-san remained at her table, Hana made 1 final cup of tea for herself. She chose something different this time, a hojicha made with late harvest leaves, roasted darker than usual, with a depth of flavor that suited the late autumn afternoon. She made it in the small celadon cup, the palest one, thin as a shell. She brought it to the small stool behind the counter and sat. She was not tired exactly, but there was something about this time of day, this particular quality of the grey afternoon light, and the soft rain still falling in the lane outside, and the smell of the café around her, the accumulated warmth of the morning's work that made her feel deeply, completely at rest. Yoshida-san was looking at the window. The mist had returned on the glass. The lane outside was its soft, blurred self. The lantern above the door had been joined by a second amber light somewhere further down the lane. A neighbour beginning to prepare for the evening. The two lights reflected in the wet pavement softly, two small circles of warmth in the grey. Hannah held her cup. She looked at the lights. She thought about her grandmother, who had sat on this same stool at this same time of day and looked at this same lane through this same window, who had made the same teas in the same pots with the same hands that knew what to do before the mind asked anything, who had believed, as Hannah believed, that the small things, the warm cup, the particular smell of rain, the sound of a page turning, the light in a paper lantern, were not small at all, that they were, in fact, the thing itself, the whole of it, everything that mattered, distilled into a warm room on a rainy morning, everything that people were looking for. When they walked down this narrow lane, following a smell they could not identify, and a warmth they had not expected, everything that the world, in its noise and speed and insistence, sometimes made it difficult to remember, was always there, always available, always waiting. In the warmth of a cup held in both hands, in the sound of rain on old stone, in the amber glow of a paper lantern, steady in the grey. The afternoon deepened toward evening without hurry. The light in the lane shifted from pale grey to something slightly warmer, slightly deeper, the particular quality of autumn late afternoon light that always seems to carry within it some awareness of its own brevity. Hannah began the slow process of closing. Not yet. There was still an hour or more before she would lock the door and extinguish the lantern and walk home through the quiet lanes. But she began the small preparatory acts that marked the turning of the day. She brought the remaining dorayaki to Yoshida-san's table on a small dish, a gift at the end of a long quiet morning, in the way that gifts between people who have known each other for decades can be. Wordless, simple, entirely understood. Yoshida-san accepted them with both hands and a small bow. She ate the last one slowly, looking at the rain. Hana washed the used cups at the small sink, turning each one in the warm water, feeling the roughness of the ceramic under her fingers. She set them on the drying rack upside down, a row of small rounded bottoms, each one a slightly different shade, a slightly different shape, a record of every potter's hands, every firing, every morning's use. She wiped down the tables with a clean cloth. She straightened the cushions. She refilled the glass jar of barley grain for tomorrow. Outside, the rain continued. It would probably rain through the night. She did not mind this. She liked the sound of rain in the dark. It made sleep, when it came, feel particularly deep and particularly deserved, as though the rain were a curtain drawn around the night, making it softer and more complete. Yoshida-san rose from her cushion with careful deliberateness. She smoothed the front of her jacket. She bowed to Hannah. Hannah returned the bow. A pause. And then, in the particular silence that exists between two people who understand each other well and need very few words, she said simply, "Gochiso samadeshita." It was the phrase one says after receiving food or tea or hospitality. It means at its simplest, it was a feast, but it means in the feeling beneath the words, thank you for this, for all of this, for the warmth and the quiet and the care with which you made this cup of tea and this morning and this small, beautiful room. Thank you for making a place where a person can rest, Hana said. Arigatou gozaimashita. Thank you for coming. Yoshida-san slipped on her shoes at the door. She picked up her umbrella. She stepped out into the lane. The door slid closed behind her, and Hana stood for a moment in the quiet of the empty cafe, listening to the rain. The cafe held its quiet. The paper lantern above the door glowed amber in the grey lane outside. The row of ceramic cups waited on the shelf. The clay pots rested on their burner, cooling now, spent of their warmth and their contents, ready to be filled again tomorrow. The incense had burned down to the last of its ash. The wooden beams above were still. The floor did not creak. Even the rain seemed to have gentled further. It was barely more than a suggestion of rain now, a soft, persistent presence in the air, the kind that leaves everything slightly luminous. The lane outside glistened, the lanterns reflected in the wet stone. The building stood dark and still. No one walked in the lane. The world for this moment was entirely still. Hana put on her coat. She turned off the gas burner. She extinguished the interior lights one by one, leaving only the warm glow of the lantern above the door. She stood for a moment in the near darkness of the empty cafe. She breathed in. The smell of it, tea and wood and old stone and the rain outside, was the smell of her entire life, of her grandmother's hands, of every morning she had stood at this counter, of every cup she had filled and carried and set down with both hands before a person who needed warmth. She breathed it in, she breathed it out. She slid open the door. The cool evening air met her face, damp and clean and carrying the smell of rain on old stone. She stepped outside. She turned the key in the lock. She looked up at the paper lantern, still burning. She would leave it lit a little longer, in case someone came down the lane in the rain and needed to follow something warm, in case someone was cold and needed a light to walk toward, in case someone was tired and needed to know that a small warm room was still here, still waiting, the way it had always been, the way it would always be. She turned and walked slowly down the rain-dark lane, her footsteps quiet on the old stone. Behind her the lantern glowed, amber in the grey, steady and warm, a small light, a small room, a small cup of tea, and the rain falling, always the rain, falling gently on everything, making the world soft, making the night quiet, making sleep, when it finally comes, deep and long and full of rest. You are here now, in this quiet place. The rain is falling outside, the lantern is lit, the tea has been made and drunk, and the cups have been washed and set to dry. The cafe is resting, the lane is resting, the whole city is resting, and you are resting too. Let your body sink a little deeper, let your thoughts grow a little slower. There is nothing to carry tonight, there is nothing to solve or plan or hold. The rain will take care of everything. It will fall through the night, soft and steady, the way rain falls in Kyoto in autumn, without urgency, without end, washing everything clean, making everything quiet, making everything dark and still and warm. Let it fall, let it carry you, further and further and further still, into the deep, into the quiet, into the long, warm, restful dark. Good night.